The handcuffs were already clicking before she could set down her coffee cup. Sheriff Marlon Creed had walked into Dusty Fork Diner with 2 deputies at his back and a look on his face like he'd already decided how this was going to go. The woman sitting at the corner, table dark hair pulled back, scrubs slightly wrinkled from a 12-hour shift 2 days ago, didn't run. Didn't flinch. She just looked at him the way a person looks at something they've been waiting for. "Lena Vasek," the sheriff announced, loud enough for every head in the diner to turn. "You're coming with me." What nobody in that diner knew. Not the waitress gripping her order pad, not the retired foreman 3 stools down, not the 2 deputies flanking the sheriff was that the woman in the nurse's scrubs had spent 6 years operating in places most people didn't know existed. The sheriff thought he was making an arrest. He was actually triggering the end of his own career. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way through, because it only gets bigger from here. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The town of Harwick Crossing sat 40 miles from anything most people would call significant. It had a water tower, a feed supply store, a 2-pump gas station on the highway turnoff, and a diner that had been operating under the same family name for 31 years. The kind of place where everyone knew who you were before you introduced yourself, and where strangers got looked at sideways until they either left or stayed long enough to become something else. Lena Vasek had been in Harwick Crossing for 14 months. To the people who worked alongside her at Grover County Medical Center, she was the ER nurse who showed up early and left late, who remembered patients' names from 3 visits ago, who kept her voice down when everything around her was escalating. She wasn't unfriendly. She wasn't warm in the easy way some people were warm. She was steady, the kind of steady that felt like something you could press against when things got bad, and it wouldn't move. Nobody asked too many questions about her past. She'd said she came from out west, that she'd done travel nursing before settling here. She had a small rented house on Cutter Road, with a vegetable garden she barely kept up with, and a truck that needed a new muffler. She brought homemade food to potlucks and helped carry chairs after community meetings. She fit in the functional, unremarkable way that some people just do. What she hadn't told anyone, not her coworkers, not her landlord, not the woman who cut her hair every 8 weeks at the salon on Pemberton Street, was that before nursing school, before the licensure exams, before the 12-hour shifts and the controlled chaos of a working emergency room, she had spent 4 years as a United States Army combat medic, deployed across 2 overseas assignments. And before that career formally ended, she had been recruited into a federal operations unit that spent the next 6 years running corruption investigations embedded within communities. Quiet, long-term, invisible work. The kind of work that required you to become someone else and stay there until the job was done. The job in Harwick Crossing was not done. The morning of March 14th started the way most of Lena's mornings did. She was up at 5:15, made coffee on the stove, ate 2 eggs over a piece of toast she'd burned slightly and scraped over the sink. She had a 7 a.m. shift, but she was meeting Doris Pellman for breakfast first. Doris was 62, worked the registration desk at the medical center, and had taken it upon herself 12 months ago to make sure Lena had at least 1 meal a week that didn't come from a hospital vending machine or her own distracted cooking. They met at Dusty Fork on Thursdays. Lena parked on the gravel shoulder, grabbed her badge lanyard off the passenger seat out of habit, and walked in. The diner was the usual morning crowd. 2 booths of highway workers. A family with a toddler in a high chair who was systematically destroying a pile of pancakes. 3 older men at the counter who appeared to be in the middle of an argument about weather patterns that looked like it had been going on for decades. Doris was already there, at the corner table. With a pot of coffee, she'd apparently convinced the waitress to just leave. "You look tired," Doris said, pouring Lena a cup before she'd even sat down. "I'm fine. You said that last week, too." Because it was also true last week. Lena pulled off her jacket, hung it over the chair back. Overnight was rough. MVA around 2 in the morning. Young guy not wearing a seatbelt, Doris made a face. "He make it?" "Yeah, but it was close." She picked up the mug with both hands. "How's your sister?" "Complaining." "Which I take as a good sign." Doris opened the laminated menu even though she ordered the same thing every time. "Marlene Foote told me she saw your truck parked outside the Breck farm last weekend. You doing house calls now?" "I know Harold Breck from the ER. His oxygen concentrator was giving him trouble, and he lives alone. I just took a look at it." Doris lowered the menu and looked at her. "You know, most people, when they're not working, don't go fix other people's equipment for free. Most people aren't Harold Breck." Doris smiled in the way she did when she was fond of someone and a little exasperated by them at the same time. She was about to say something else when the bell above the diner door hit the frame too hard. That was the first thing. The sound of a door that someone pushed open with too much force, in a place where nobody ever pushed the door with too much force. Lena didn't look immediately. She took a sip of coffee. But she registered it, the way she registered everything, not with alarm, just with attention. Then the room changed. The way rooms change when authority walks in, and it's not the friendly kind. She heard boots on the linoleum. More than one set. And then she heard someone clear their throat in a way that was designed to be heard by the whole room. She turned. Sheriff Marlon Creed was standing 6 feet from the door, with Deputies Holt and Satterfield behind him. Creed was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a face that looked like it had been angry for a long time, and had just stopped apologizing for it. He wore his authority the way some men wear a too-tight shirt, conspicuously, and without comfort. His eyes found her immediately, which told her two things. He knew exactly who he was looking for, and he'd been thinking about this for a while. "Lena Vasek," he said with that practiced volume that turned heads. Every conversation in the diner stopped. She set her mug down. "Sheriff, I need you to stand up and come with me." Doris had gone completely still across the table, her menu frozen in both hands. Lena didn't move right away. Not out of defiance. She'd learned a long time ago that stillness read as control in situations like this, and control was what she needed people to see. On what basis? Interfering with an active investigation. He said it like he'd rehearsed it, which he probably had. "We've had some questions about incidents in the hospital. You've been avoiding our outreach for 3 days. I wasn't aware I had any obligation to respond to informal inquiries." She kept her voice flat and even. "If you have documentation, I have a warrant." He didn't reach for it. Just said the word and let it sit there, a blunt instrument. Holt already had the handcuffs out. Lena looked at the deputy, then at the cuffs, then at Creed. She did the math. She had 3 different ways she could have handled what came next. 2 of them would have resolved the situation, without anyone in that diner ever knowing her name again. But she wasn't here for the fast way. She was here for the right way, which took longer and asked more of her. She stood up. "Okay," she said quietly. Doris made a small wounded sound. "Lena, it's all right, Doris." She kept her eyes on the table for a half second. "Call the center and let them know I might be late." "You might be a lot more than late," Creed said. He nodded to Holt. The handcuffs went on in front of the entire diner. The family with the toddler, the highway workers, the 3 men at the counter, the young waitress with the order pad who'd been coming over with Lena's toast. Everyone watched. That was Lena understood the point. The Grover County Sheriff's Department occupied a converted hardware store on the main road, which explained why the holding area still smelled faintly of machine oil, no matter how many times they painted over it. Lena sat in the processing room for 2 hours before anyone came to talk to her. She used the time the way she'd learned to use it. Not worrying, not rehearsing. Just sitting with what she knew and letting it organize itself. What she knew, Marlon Creed had been the subject of her unit's attention for 16 months. He had been systematically suppressing incident reports involving use of force complaints against 3 of his deputies. At least 7 filed complaints had gone missing from the county system in the last 2 years. 2 witnesses in a civil rights case from the year before had withdrawn their testimony within weeks of being questioned by Creed personally. One of them had left the county entirely. Nobody had followed up. She also knew that the formal investigation was 90% complete. The documentation was in place. All it needed was 6 more weeks. What she hadn't anticipated was Creed moving on her first, which meant he'd gotten closer to identifying her than anyone had calculated. That was a problem. The door opened. It wasn't Creed. It was a younger deputy she didn't recognize, fresh-faced, uncomfortable, carrying a paper cup of water like an offering. "Ma'am," he set the cup on the table. "The sheriff will be in shortly." "Thank you." She waited until he started to leave. "What's your name?" He turned back. "Pruitt. Deputy Pruitt." "How long have you been with the department, Deputy Pruitt?" He blinked. "Going on 8 months. You like it?" He looked at her for a second, like the question didn't quite fit the room they were in. "It's good work?" "Good." She meant it. "It can be good work." He left, and the door closed, and she went back to sitting with what she knew. Creed came in 40 minutes later. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat in it backward, arms folded over the top rail, which was the body language equivalent of announcing that he ran things here. "Lena Vasek," he said again. He had a file folder in front of him, thin. He didn't open it. "You've said my name 3 times now. You can try Lena if it's easier." Something moved in his eyes. Not anger exactly. More like the particular irritation of a man who expects deference and keeps not receiving it. You want to tell me about your relationship with a man named Garrett Sowell? Garrett Sowell was a pharmacist at the county outpatient clinic who had 6 months ago quietly passed documentation to her about irregular prescription records that appeared connected to Creed's deputy, Holt. Lena had been careful about that contact. Apparently not careful enough. She kept her face neutral. He fills prescriptions at the clinic. I've referred patients there. You were seen having a conversation with him in the parking lot of Kemper's Hardware on a Sunday, during which he handed you a large envelope. She hadn't known about the photo. That was useful information, even if it was uncomfortable. He gave me documentation about a patient, she said calmly. Coordination of care. HIPAA doesn't prohibit. I'm not interested in HIPAA. He leaned forward. I'm interested in what you're doing in this county, Ms. Vasek, because I've been in this department for 19 years, and I know when someone is doing exactly what they appear to be doing and when they're not. She looked at him steadily. I'm a nurse, say. He tapped the folder. 3 different staffers at Grover County Medical have mentioned your name in connection with informal inquiries about departmental conduct. One of them is our direct liaison with the ER. You've been asking questions. I ask questions about everything. It's part of the job. It's not part of your job to ask about law enforcement conduct. It is when that conduct affects patient outcomes. The temperature in the room shifted, just slightly. She watched his jaw set. You're suspended, he said flatly. Pending the investigation, I've been in contact with the medical center. Your badge access has been deactivated as of 30 minutes ago. She absorbed that the hospital. That was the piece that hurt, not personally, but operationally. Her access to records, to staff, to the daily rhythms she'd been using to track the pattern of Creed's influence on the county's systems. You're arresting me and suspending my access to my job based on what, exactly? She said. Based on a formal inquiry that I have every legal right to conduct. He stood up. You'll be released this afternoon. But I'd think carefully about how you spend your time while you're out of a job, Miss Vasek. Harwick Crossing isn't a large place. He picked up the folder, walked to the door. She was just having breakfast, she said. He stopped. Doris Pellman, Lena continued. She's 62, she works registration. She has a sister in Clover Ridge with a bad hip. She was just having breakfast, and you walked in and put handcuffs on her friend in front of the whole room. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Think about that when you're thinking about how you conduct yourself. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she saw something she'd seen before in men like him. The specific fear of someone who has operated without consequences for long enough that they've forgotten consequences exist. He left without responding. They processed her out at 2:47 p.m. Doris was in the parking lot, parked crookedly in a loading zone with her hazards going, and when Lena came through the door, she was out of the car before the engine was fully off. Are you okay? I've been calling that awful building for 3 hours, and no one would tell me anything. And I talked to Administrator Fenn at the medical center, and he said your access was. She stopped herself. Looked at Lena's face. What happened in there? What I expected, Lena said. I'm okay. You don't look okay. You look like you're doing that thing where you decide to be fine, regardless of whether you are. Doris. I know. Get in the car. She grabbed Lena's arm and steered her toward the passenger door. I made soup. The kind with the barley, before you say anything. They drove back to Lena's house in the kind of quiet that meant both of them were thinking too hard to speak. The vegetable garden looked worse than usual in the pale afternoon light. Half the beds needed turning, and the tomato cages she'd never properly staked were leaning at unhelpful angles. Doris made the soup while Lena sat at the kitchen table and went through what her phone had missed during the time they'd held it at the station. 7 texts. 4 of them from coworkers who'd already heard. 1 from a number she didn't recognize, which she'd deal with later. This isn't right, Doris said from the stove. What he did. In front of everyone in the diner? No, it's not right. So what are you going to do? Lena looked at the table. What I'm supposed to do. Which is? She didn't answer that, and Doris, after a moment, didn't push. That night Lena sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a second cup of coffee gone cold and sent a secure message to the contact she communicated with through a system most people didn't know existed. Target is aware, moved faster than projected. Access compromised. Timeline needs to compress. Need authorization for acceleration. The response came back 11 minutes later, which told her the person on the other end had been watching for her. Acknowledged. Do not break cover, maintain position. Events may accelerate on their own. She read it twice. Then she closed the laptop and stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the dark garden and the darker field beyond it. Events may accelerate on their own. She didn't like that. She liked known quantities. Controlled variables. Years in the Army had given her that preference, and years in the field had deepsed it into something close to a requirement. The feeling of a situation running on its own momentum, without her hand on it, was the feeling she liked least in the world. She went to sleep at 10:30 and was up again at 4. The call came at 5:47 a.m. She heard it from the bathroom, where she was halfway through washing her face, and something about the hour and the specific insistence of the ring made her move faster than she normally did. She grabbed the phone from the nightstand. Unknown number. She answered it anyway. Ms. Vasek, male voice, controlled, unfamiliar. This is Ray Okonkwo. I'm a dispatcher with County Emergency Services. I'm calling every medical contact I can reach. We have a major incident on Highway 9 multi-car pileup, at least 30 vehicles, tanker fire. Initial estimates are 60-plus casualties. County EMS is completely overwhelmed. Grover County Medical is asking for any available medical personnel. I have you listed in the county registry. As I'm on my way, she said. Which mile marker? A beat of surprise. Mile marker 44 westbound approach. 15 minutes. She was already pulling clothes off the chair. She'd set them on the night before. Do you have field staging established? We're working on it. Scene is still. Get me to whoever is running medical operations when I arrive. Tell them Vasek ER. And whatever you do, make sure the tanker suppression doesn't push toward the civilian vehicles on the north shoulder. She hung up. Highway 9 at 6. 4 a.m. was the kind of scene that shut something down in a person's chest and required them to make a choice, in approximately 4 seconds, about whether they were going to be useful or not. The tanker was jackknifed across the center median, half burning, and the smoke column it was throwing was visible from 2 miles out. The pileup extended in both directions from the original impact point. It had started as a 6-car collision in reduced visibility fog and cascaded in the space of 40 seconds into something that had consumed a third of a mile of highway. There were people standing in the road, people sitting on the shoulder, people still in vehicles. A woman was kneeling next to someone flat on the ground near the center barrier, pressing both hands to a wound that Lena could see from 30 feet away was not being managed correctly. She parked the truck on the grass shoulder and grabbed the jump kit she kept behind the driver's seat. It was stocked well beyond the standard, which was something she'd been doing since her second overseas deployment, and walked toward the nearest concentrations of people. The county EMS unit she found first had 2 paramedics running between 4 different patients with the specific controlled panic of people who had received more than they'd budgeted for. I'm Lena Vasek. I'm an ER nurse, she said to the first one she reached. Tell me your highest acuity patients and how many critical you're still fielding. The paramedic, a young woman named Rios, according to her jacket, looked up from where she was kneeling. Are you serious? Yes. A half-second assessment of Lena's face, apparently sufficient. 6 critical. 2 of them are bleeding out. The rest are respiratory from smoke exposure. I have 1 more unit arriving in 8 minutes, and the trauma team from the medical center is 20 minutes out. Where's your most critical right now? White SUV, north shoulder, rear of the pileup. Male mid-30s, femur fracture with vascular involvement. My partner's there, but he's out of his depth. Lena was already moving. The man in the white SUV had a name, which she learned later was Donahue. At 6:09 a.m., he had a tourniquet applied incorrectly above the fracture, a blood pressure that was not going to sustain itself for another 20 minutes, and a paramedic named Garver, who was competent and exhausted, and visibly relieved to have someone arrive who knew what they were looking at. She didn't introduce herself. She assessed. Tourniquet's too distal, she said. We need it 3 inches higher. Do you have a second one? Yes, put it there. Don't touch the first one yet. She reached into her kit. He's in early shock. Pump position, elevate his legs if his spine is clear. We don't have C-spine clearance. Then we work with what we have. She was looking at Donahue's face, his color, his breathing, talking to him while she worked, which mattered for reasons that weren't just clinical. Hey, stay with me. What's your name, Travis? He said, thready but present. Travis, you're going to be okay. I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me. Can you do that? Yeah. A pause. What's your name? Lena. She applied pressure with one hand and used the other to check his radial pulse. Weak but present. Tell me something. You got kids, Travis? 2, boy and a girl. Good. Think about them. Stay with me. In the next 14 minutes, she stabilized Travis Donahue to a degree that the trauma surgeon, who later reviewed the field record, described in writing as beyond what the circumstances should have produced. She then moved to the next patient, and the one after that, working through the triage system she'd built in her head during the walk. From her truck, highest acuity first, respiratory compromise second, fractures third, psychological in a separate category that she was tracking in parallel. At some point she became aware that she was being listened to. Not just followed or assisted. Listened to. The paramedics on scene had started moving in the direction she indicated without her having to repeat herself. The EMS supervisor, who arrived from the county at 6:35, had taken one look at the organization that had developed on the north shoulder and asked who had set it up. Vasek, Rios had said, pointing. She didn't stop working to acknowledge that. There was still too much to do. The military vehicles appeared at 7:10 a.m. She registered them at the edge of her awareness, 2 government SUVs and a transport vehicle, pulling onto the highway shoulder with the particular purposefulness of people who had been directed to a specific location and filed it under things to address when she had a hand free. She had a hand free at 7:24 a.m. when the trauma team from Grover County Medical finally arrived in sufficient numbers to establish full coverage. She stepped back from the immediate staging area and stripped off one glove, then the other. Her hands were steady. They always were during. It was afterward that they sometimes wanted to shake, and she never let them. She looked up, and there were 2 men in federal agency attire, standing 12 feet away. One of them she recognized. She didn't let that show. He was a man named Aldrich Fain, and the last time she'd been in the same room with him, she'd been going through a debrief at a facility in Northern Virginia. He was in his late 40s, dark-suited with a face that had seen the kind of work that aged it differently than ordinary stress aged a face. He was looking at her with an expression that said he recognized her too, and that her being here, in this field, running this operation, was not something he had been prepared for this morning. The other man she didn't know. Younger, taller, watching the scene with the assessment eyes of someone trained to categorize situations. Fain walked toward her. "Vasek," he said, quiet enough that it didn't carry. Fain. She kept her voice the same. He looked at the scene around them, the organized staging, the patient tracking she'd established on a clipboard that 3 different EMS personnel were now contributing to, the clear zones she'd designated for landing once they got aerial medical support mobilized. He looked at it for about 4 seconds. "You've been busy," he said. There were 60-plus casualties and 4 paramedics. She pulled her 3rd glove from her kit and realized she'd used the last of them. "Are you here for the accident?" "We're here because Sheriff Creed filed a complaint about federal interference this morning," he said, citing specifically irregular conduct by a county medical employee. He paused. "And because we've been monitoring his communications for the last 3 weeks." He tipped his hand. "More than that." Fain looked at her for a long moment. "He filed that complaint at 5 a.m., before this accident happened. He was planning to push this through the county legal system this morning." Lena processed that. Creed had gotten up at 5 in the morning to begin dismantling her. He'd been more certain of himself than she'd realized. The irony was that his certainty had sent 2 federal agents to a highway accident scene where she'd just 70 minutes doing something that was going to be very hard for anyone to explain away. "He doesn't know," she said. It wasn't a question. "He doesn't know what you are," Fain confirmed. He thought he was moving against a problematic nurse. Behind them, someone was calling her name. One of the paramedics holding up a clipboard, needing a decision about a patient she'd flagged for secondary review. She looked at Fain. "I have to get back," she said. "Go," he said. "We'll talk after." She walked back toward the staging area. Fain's partner said something to him that she didn't catch. She heard Fain's answer clearly. "That woman just ran a mass casualty incident better than the county's entire emergency infrastructure," he said. "And she's been doing it from inside a nursing role for 14 months. She didn't look back. Travis Donahue was being loaded into the helicopter that had just landed on the flat stretch of shoulder she'd cleared. His face was pale, and his eyes were half open, but he was breathing and his blood pressure had held. The boy and the girl had their father. Somewhere on the other side of the accident scene, she knew the situation had shifted. The weight of it had redistributed. The man who'd put handcuffs on her in a diner 24 hours ago had, without understanding what he was doing, handed the federal case against him something it didn't have before: visibility. Bodies on the ground. Agents in the field. A woman in scrubs running a crisis that made his version of her completely impossible to sustain. She took a new set of gloves from a paramedic's kit, pulled them on, and went back to work. She'd think about what came next later. Right now there were people who needed a steady pair of hands, and she had them. She always had them. The last patient she reached before the trauma team took full command was a teenage boy, maybe 15, sitting on a highway barrier, with a laceration across his forearm and a look on his face that said he had not yet decided whether he was going to hold it together. She sat down next to him on the concrete rail and started cleaning the wound without preamble. "You the one who was organizing everything," he said, watching her work. "Was helping. Those paramedics were doing what you told them. They were doing their jobs. I just helped them organize it. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking. My mom's in one of the other cars. They said she's okay, but nobody will let me go to her. What's your name? Micah, your mom is okay. They said that's because it's true. The moment this is dressed, and we know your arm doesn't need more than this, someone will walk you to her. That's a promise. She looked up at him briefly. Can you hold this for me? He pressed the gauze where she indicated. His hand was shaking. You were a soldier, he said. She looked at him. He nodded toward her hands the way she was working. The kit, something in the efficiency of it he'd apparently read somehow the way teenagers sometimes see things adults have learned to stop noticing. A long time ago, she said, and now you're a nurse? Yeah. He thought about it. That's kind of a weird combination. She looked back at his arm. Maybe. Or maybe it's exactly the right one. 2 minutes later, she walked him to his mother. And across the highway, in the 2 government SUVs parked on the shoulder, with their doors open against the cold spring morning, Aldrich Fane was on a secure line reporting something to someone whose authorization level was considerably higher than a county sheriff's. What Marlon Creed had started that morning in the Dusty Fork Diner had become something he no longer had any power to stop. He just didn't know that yet. By the time the last ambulance cleared Highway 9, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off most of the fog, and what was left of the scene looked like something between a disaster and a controlled demolition debris cleared to the shoulders, vehicles marked and numbered, the scorched outline of the tanker's skid still visible across the center lane like a scar the road would carry for a while. Lena sat on the tailgate of her truck and drank half a bottle of water in one long pull. She was tired in the specific way that came after, sustained focus, not exhausted, not broken, but emptied out in a way that required a few minutes of just existing before she could make decisions again. Her scrubs had someone else's blood on the left sleeve, and her boots were going to need work before she wore them into a clean environment. She'd been on her feet for just over 3 hours. She'd worked on 22 patients, flagged 6 for immediate surgical transfer, and managed the field staging for a scene that had arrived with no organizational structure and left with something that at least resembled one. She cataloged all of it without ceremony, the way she cataloged everything, and then she set it aside. Fane was walking toward her, alone this time. He stopped about 6 feet out and looked at her the way he always had, like he was doing math, and she was part of the equation. You need anything? I'm fine. That's never actually an answer. It is today. She capped the water bottle. Talk to me. He put his hands in his coat pockets. The sheriff filed his complaint at 5:15 this morning. He had a county legal contact waiting to receive it, which means he didn't draft that this week. He's been building a paper case against you for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She'd underestimated his institutional paranoia, and the knowledge of that sat unpleasantly in her chest. What does the complaint allege? Unauthorized interference with law enforcement operations. Falsification of professional credentials. He paused. An unauthorized collection of confidential records from the county system. She looked at him. He doesn't have evidence of that last one because it doesn't exist. I know that. You know that. He knows that too, which means he's using the allegation as a mechanism, not a fact. He wants the medical center to complete the suspension and push it toward revocation. If your nursing license is challenged, it buys him time. Time to do what? Clean house. Fane shifted his weight. We've been monitoring his internal communications for 3 weeks. In the last 4 days, there have been 7 encrypted message exchanges with a contact we haven't fully identified yet. The content suggests he knows something is closing in on him, and he's moving assets, documents, and people. 2 of the complainants from the civil rights case, the ones who withdrew one of them, has left the county again. We think Creed pressured the other one last week. That was the piece that made her jaw tighten. Not the threat to herself, which was manageable. The witnesses being pushed around again, that was the part that had actual weight. How much time do we have? She said. Officially, your suspension is pending review. That process takes between 2 and 4 weeks under county employment policy. We could intervene on your behalf, but that would expose the operation prematurely. Don't intervene. She said it without hesitation. Fane studied her. You understand that means you're going into this period without institutional cover. I understand. Vasek moved because he's scared, she said. Scared men make mistakes. If we intervene now, we hand him a narrative. Federal overreach, targeting a small-town sheriff. He'll use it, and he'll find people who believe it. She looked out at the road, where a highway patrol unit was still managing the remaining traffic. Let it run. I'll manage. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when he disagreed with something, but had enough respect for the reasoning to step back from it. "We'll maintain passive surveillance," he said. "If the threat level changes, you'll hear from me." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, which she knew was not actually a business card, the number on it routed through 2 layers before reaching anything real. She took it anyway. "One more thing," he said. "What you did out here today. The coordination, the triage structure, the patient outcomes." He paused. "People saw it. The MS supervisor filed a field report before we'd even left the scene. The trauma surgeon, who arrived at 7:40, is apparently very interested in who set up the secondary staging. They were going to figure it out eventually. Maybe. But the timing is what it is." He looked at her. "Your cover's not blown, but the edges of it are getting transparent." She knew that. She'd known it the moment she'd told Rios to redirect the second EMS unit, and the woman had done it without questioning who she was. Some things couldn't be helped. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I didn't exactly have a choice," he said dryly, and walked back toward the government SUVs. She drove home, showered, changed, ate something that wasn't particularly good but was sufficient, and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. Old habit from a supervisor years ago, who'd told her that the problem with digital records was that everything you wrote down existed somewhere you couldn't fully control, but paper you could destroy in about 40 seconds. She never wrote anything that mattered digitally, if she could help it. She wrote down what she knew about Creed's timeline, what she knew about the witness contact, what Fane had said about the encrypted communications and the unidentified contact. She drew connections and crossed out the ones that didn't hold and circled 3 things she needed to verify before she could move. Then she sat with what she had, which was less than she wanted, and more than she'd had yesterday morning. The phone rang. "It was Doris," she answered. "I've been asking around," Doris said without preamble. "Carefully. I know how to be careful. Doris, don't Doris me. I've worked registration at that hospital for 17 years, and I know where information lives. Marlon Creed called Administrator Fenn directly at 7 a.m. yesterday, not through the department liaison directly. He asked Fenn to accelerate the suspension process and flag your file for potential credential review. Lena had known that was coming, but hearing the sequence of it 7 a.m. directly, Accelerate told her something about the urgency Creed was operating under. He was not being patient or procedural. He was applying pressure in real time. "Is Fenn cooperating with him?" she said. "Fenn is a man who doesn't like conflict and likes his budget allocation," Doris said, which was the most complete character summary of Fenn that Lena had ever heard. "He's not Creed's person, but he's the kind of man who responds to pressure by taking the path that removes the pressure. Right now, you're the pressure." "I know. There's something else." A pause that had texture to it. "One of the night shift nurses, Polly Abrams, she came to me this morning. She said a deputy was in the ER 2 weeks ago asking questions about you. Not official questions, informal ones. Who you talked to, who you spent time with, whether you ever stayed late in the records area." Lena wrote that down. The records area. That was specific. What did Polly tell him? Nothing useful. She didn't like the way he was asking. A beat. "Lena, what's actually going on?" There were several answers to that question. Most of them were true. None of them were something she could give Doris. "Something that's being handled," she said. "I need you to do something for me. Name it. Don't ask questions about this anymore. Not because I don't trust you, because I do, more than almost anyone here. But the more you know, the more risk you're carrying, and I won't do that to you." A long silence. "You're not just a nurse," Doris said. She said it quietly, without drama, the way someone says a thing they've been sitting with for a while and have finally decided to let out. "I am a nurse," Lena said. "That part's completely real." Another silence. "Fine," Doris said at last. "But you call me. If anything happens, I will." She hung up and looked at the legal pad. The deputy in the records area 2 weeks ago. That was before Creed had arrested her, which meant the surveillance on her had been running longer than she'd thought, and broader, not just her external contacts, but her behavior inside the hospital. She needed to move the documentation she'd accumulated. There were files she'd been storing in a manner she'd believed was secure. She now had reason to believe that belief had an expiration date. She went to the second bedroom, which she used as a home office. Against the wall, behind a stack of medical reference texts that were genuinely there, because she genuinely used them, there was a locked document safe she'd installed herself 2 weeks after arriving in Harwick Crossing. She opened it and went through its contents methodically. Hard copies of records she'd obtained through legal means she was careful about that, always careful, because illegally obtained evidence was a door that swung both ways. Printed communications. A chain of custody log that she'd maintained with the discipline of someone who'd seen how easily a case could unravel when the documentation wasn't airtight. She pulled 2 files that she needed to relocate, locked the rest, and spent 20 minutes doing what needed doing. When she was finished, she sat on the edge of the office chair and let herself be tired for exactly 3 minutes. Then she stood up. Garrett Sowell called the next morning from a number he'd never used before, which told her the call was urgent and that he was scared. Came to the clinic, he said. 2 of them. Not official, they didn't show ID. But one of them was Holt. Deputy Holt. Creed's closest deputy, the one at the center of the prescription irregularity records that Garrett had originally passed to her. The fact that Holt was personally appearing at the clinic told her that Creed had identified Garrett as a link in the chain. What did they say, she said. They wanted to talk about a pharmacist who'd been sharing confidential records. His voice was doing something tight and effortful. They didn't threaten me. They didn't have to. Are you safe right now? I'm at home. I called in sick. Good, stay there. Don't contact anyone else about this. Do you have someone you can stay with tonight who's not in the county? A pause. My brother's in Dellard. Go there tonight. Not tomorrow. She kept her voice even. Don't take anything that looks like documents. Just go visit your brother. Take your time, Lena. He was trying to keep his voice steady and not entirely succeeding. If they know about me, they know you talked to someone. They don't know what you gave me. There's a difference, and right now that difference matters. She let a beat pass. You did the right thing. What you gave me, it's going to matter. I need you to trust that and stay out of the way so it can. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay. She hung up and sat with the specific weight of being responsible for someone who hadn't signed up for the risks she was built to carry. On the 3rd day after her suspension, a woman she didn't know knocked on her door at 10 in the morning. Late 50s, practical clothing, reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair. She held a business card at her side rather than extending it, which Lena noticed. Ms. Vasek? My name is Adela Morrow. I'm an investigative correspondent with the Grover County Dispatch. A beat. I'm sorry to come to your home. I got your address from the county directory, which I realize isn't ideal. What do you want? Lena said. I want to talk about the accident on Highway 9, and about what you did there. She paused. And about why a county sheriff had an ER nurse arrested in a diner the morning before it happened. Lena studied her. The card, the glasses, the way she was holding herself, not aggressive, not angling. She looked like someone who'd been doing this long enough to have stopped performing confidence and had arrived somewhere that just was what it was. I can't talk to you, Lena said. Can't or can't? She held the woman's eyes. Not right now. For reasons I can't explain to you right now. Something moved in Morrow's face. Recognition of a kind. I've been covering Grover County for 11 years, she said slower now. I've written 4 stories about Creed's department that never ran because I couldn't get them past editorial without additional sourcing. I have 2 witnesses who've spoken to me off record that I haven't been able to corroborate. She let that sit. I'm not looking for a quote from you. I'm trying to understand what's happening. Lena looked at the business card in Morrow's hand. She looked at the woman's face. She thought about Fain saying, events may accelerate on their own, and about what that meant for the shape of the next few weeks. Give me the card, she said. Morrow handed it over. I'm not going to call you, Lena said. But don't throw away your notes. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the card. 11 years, 4 stories that didn't run, 2 off-record witnesses. In 14 months of being inside this county's structures, she'd built an evidentiary record. Morrow had been building a parallel one from the outside with a fraction of the access, and probably considerably more resistance, and she was still here, still knocking on doors. That meant something. She put the card in her jacket pocket. The call she'd been waiting for came that afternoon. Not Fain, not Garrett. A number she'd stored under a generic label that rang twice, stopped, rang twice again. She answered on the next ring. They moved, the voice said. It was a woman early 40s, economical with words. Lena knew her as Marsh, though that wasn't a name in any formal sense. Creed made contact with County Councilmember Dex Plunkett 40 minutes ago. In person, no phone, we had eyes on the location. Plunkett. She'd had him on the periphery of her map for months, a county council member who'd been on the budget committee that approved the sheriff's department funding for 7 consecutive years, who'd voted against the independent oversight measure 3 times, who had lunch with Creed the first Thursday of every month with a consistency that was too regular to be coincidence. What was the outcome of the contact, she said. Unknown. But Plunkett left the meeting and immediately called the editor of the Grover County Dispatch. She went still. Morrow's editor. Plunkett had called Morrow's editor within 40 minutes of meeting Creed. They're going to kill a story, she said. Or plant one, Marsh said. We're not sure which. But something came out of that meeting that needed to go to the paper. Lena sat with that for a second. Creed was not just defending himself. He was shaping the field, moving pieces she hadn't accounted for, using channels she'd been watching but hadn't seen him activate before, which meant he was more operational than she'd given him credit for when he was frightened. How is that possible? She said, half to herself. If he goes to the paper, any story they run about me gets scrutinized later. He's not going to run a story about you, Marsh said. Or not directly. The contact was about framing. He wants something in print that establishes a narrative before the federal process gets visible. A pause. He's smart, Vasek. I know you know that. But I want to make sure you know how smart. I know. She stood and walked to the window. What's our authorization status? Still holding position. The decision upstairs is still that premature exposure costs more than the delay. I agree with that assessment. Then you know what comes next. She did. She just didn't like it. What came next was that Creed was going to escalate again. He was operating under the belief that he could construct enough institutional pressure, the suspension, the credential review, the narrative in the press, the witnesses intimidated back into silence, to make the thing closing in on him simply stop. Because that was what had worked before, over 19 years of running a small county's law enforcement, with nobody watching closely enough to stop him. The difference was that this time, someone was watching. Marsh, she said. Yeah, the unidentified contact in his encrypted communications. Any progress? A pause that was slightly longer than a simple no would have required. Possibly. We had a partial signal intercept this morning. The contact appears to be mobile and rotating locations. But the language in the exchanges, another pause. It's not just someone he trusts. It reads like someone who has leverage over him. He's being managed? That's one interpretation. She turned that over. Creed as the threat was a known quantity. Creed as a piece of something larger was a different problem, with a different solution, and the 6 weeks remaining on her original timeline had just contracted in ways she couldn't yet calculate. She was still working through it when the phone against her ear said, "One more thing. Vasek. There's a black SUV that's done 2 passes on your street in the last hour. Doesn't match any known department vehicle." She didn't move from the window. She adjusted her angle slowly until she could see the street without being centered in the frame. The SUV was at the far end of Cutter Road, idling. Not one of Creed's. Wrong plates for the county. Wrong vehicle profile for federal surveillance, which she knew what it looked like. She left something she hadn't anticipated and hadn't yet built a category for. "I see it," she said. "Do you want extraction?" No. She kept her voice absolutely level. "Stay on the communications intercept. Find me the contact." She hung up. The SUV didn't move. She stood at the window watching it and thought about what Marsh had said. Not just someone he trusts, someone who has leverage over him. There was a name somewhere in that sentence that she didn't have yet, and until she had it, every other piece of the case was sitting on a foundation she couldn't fully trust. The SUV's engine turned over. It pulled out from the curb slowly, deliberately, and drove away in the direction of the highway. She watched until it was gone. Then she walked to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat down at the table with the legal pad. She turned to a clean page and wrote one line at the top. Who runs Creed? The question sat there on the paper, and the house was very quiet around it. And outside the window the spring afternoon was indifferent and ordinary, in the way that spring afternoons in small counties always were, regardless of what was happening inside the houses, along their roads. She was going to find the answer. But somewhere in the county, whoever had been in that SUV was already reporting back to someone about what they'd seen on Cutter Road. And Lena Vasek had approximately 48 hours before this stopped being a case she was running and became a situation she was surviving. She gave herself until morning. That was the deal she made with herself sitting at the kitchen table, with the legal pad and the cold coffee and the question written at the top of the page in her own handwriting. One night to work the problem analytically, to map what she knew against what she didn't, to find the shape of the thing before it found her. After that, she was going to have to move, regardless of whether the map was complete. She worked until 2 in the morning. By then, she had 3 pages of notes, and a headache that lived behind her left eye, and a clearer picture of what she was dealing with, none of which made her feel better. The encrypted contact, the SUV with the wrong plates, Creed moving on Morrow's editor within 40 minutes of a face-to-face meeting with Plunkett. The pattern of it wasn't random. It had the shape of something coordinated, something that had infrastructure behind it. Not just a scared county sheriff doing damage control, but a scared county sheriff with resources that extended past his department's budget and his 19 years of favors. She'd seen that shape before. Twice. In different contexts, different states, different men who thought they'd built something airtight, because they'd built it over enough time that they'd stopped being able to see the seams. The seams were always there, she wrote down. Plunkett is not peripheral. Underlined it twice. Then she went to sleep on the couch with the legal pad face down on the coffee table. Because the bedroom felt too far away and she'd learned a long time ago that being tired and being capable weren't mutually exclusive, but pretending you weren't tired cost more than it saved. The seams started showing at 7:40 the next morning, and they showed in a place she hadn't expected. She was running 4 miles along Cutter Road and back, which she did when she needed to think in a way that required her body to be doing something, when her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket with a message from a number she recognized as one of Marsh's secondaries. She stopped at the end of the road, breathing steady, and read it. Intercept identified partial location for contact. Local Grover County. Cross-referencing now. Also Dispatch ran a piece this morning. Online only. Your name is in it. She turned around and ran back faster than she'd gone out. The Grover County Dispatch piece was 380 words under the byline of a reporter named Callan Fitch, who she didn't know, which meant it hadn't come from Morrow. The headline was careful in the specific way that told her someone had been careful with it. Questions arise from suspended hospital. Employee, amid Highway 9 response. The piece didn't accuse her of anything directly. It didn't have to. It used the structure of responsible journalism as a delivery mechanism for the things it wanted to plant. It noted that she had been suspended from Grover County Medical, pending an investigation. It noted that she had been present at the Highway 9 incident and had, according to unnamed sources, taken a leadership role in patient management. It then raised, in the mildest possible language, questions about whether someone under departmental suspension should have been on an active emergency scene at all. It quoted one unnamed hospital official saying only that the situation was under review. It ended with a line about Grover County Medical maintaining its commitment to professional standards. She read it twice. Then she put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there for 30 seconds doing nothing. It was clean work. Creed and Plunkett, or whoever was running them, had found a way to take the thing that should have helped her, the Highway 9 response, the 70 minutes of field work that Fain had described as better than the county's entire emergency infrastructure, and turn it into a liability, into evidence of poor judgment, into a question mark where there should have been a period. That was not something a panicking man came up with overnight. That was something someone had ready. She picked up her phone and called Morrow. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. Marsh called at 9. The contact, Marsh said without greeting. We have a name. Took most of the night and a routing trace that I'm not going to describe to you, but we have it. Lena waited. His name is Warren Selk. He runs a private security consulting firm out of the county seat Belford, about 60 miles north. On paper, he's completely legitimate. Former state police, 12 years, retired in good standing. The firm does contract work for municipalities, some private clients. On paper, she said. On paper. Marsh paused, and in that pause, Lena heard the particular hesitation of someone organizing something that had more pieces than she wanted to say quickly. Selk has worked with 4 different county law enforcement departments over the last 9 years. In 3 of those counties, there were formal misconduct complaints filed against the departments within the 2 years before he came on as a consultant. In 2 of those cases, the complaints were ultimately resolved in favor of the department. The investigators on those cases were later found to have had undisclosed relationships with Selk's firm. Cleans them up, she said. He engineers the cleanup. He's not the one bribing investigators. He builds the infrastructure that makes the complaints go away witnesses who stop cooperating, records that get misfiled, narratives that preempt the formal findings. Another pause. He's good at it. He's been doing it for long enough that most of it looks like coincidence. Lena stood at the kitchen window, looking at the garden she still hadn't properly tended. What's his relationship to Creed? Goes back at least 6 years. We think Selk has been running this specific operation for 4 years, and that Creed's department was the original client. 4 years. She ran a quick mental calculation that put Selk's involvement starting roughly 2 years before the civil rights complaints that had initially drawn federal attention to Creed, which meant it wasn't a reaction to investigation. It was proactive. Creed had brought Selk in before there was anything to clean up, which meant he'd always known there would be. Does Fain have this? She said. He has it as of 20 minutes ago. What's his position? He wants you to maintain cover. He's building a separate evidentiary thread on Selk that can be used independently. So if the Creed prosecution gets challenged, there's a second angle. How long does that take? He said 2 weeks, minimum. She turned that over. 2 weeks. The dispatch piece was this morning. Creed was accelerating. Selk was accelerating Creed. And she had 2 weeks before federal structure caught up to the pace of what was happening on the ground. Marsh, she said, the SUV from yesterday, we ran the plates this morning. Registered to a holding company in the county seat. The holding company's registered agent is a law firm that represents several of Selk's municipal clients. So the SUV had been Selk's, not Creed's deputies doing informal surveillance. A professional, sent to verify what they already suspected about her, which meant Selk had looked at her and had not yet decided what she was. That window was closing. She needed to do something with her hands, so she went outside and worked the garden. It wasn't productive thinking. It wasn't the kind of thing that arrived in a clean line. It was the kind of thinking that happened sideways while she was pulling dead growth off the tomato plants and restaking the cages she'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. The kind of thinking that felt like it was about something else, until it wasn't. By the time she'd worked through 2 of the 4 beds, she had an idea she didn't particularly like, but couldn't find a reason to discard. She needed Morrow. Not to give her anything. Not to create a record or plant information or violate the operational boundaries that were still technically in place. But Morrow had 11 years of Grover County in her notes, and 2 off-record witnesses that nobody else knew about, and she was an independent variable that Selk hadn't fully accounted for. A journalist who'd been quietly watching this county for more than a decade was not something in his cleanup infrastructure, because the cleanup infrastructure ran on institutional channels, and a local reporter with unrunnable stories and a working relationship with off-record sources was exactly the kind of thing that slipped through institutional channels. She pulled off her gloves, walked inside, and tried Morrow again. This time it rang twice. "I was wondering if you'd call back," Morrow said. "I need to meet." "Not here, not your office." Lena was already calculating locations. "There's a diner in Kemper on Route 7, 30 miles. Can you be there in an hour?" A brief pause. "I'll be there in 50 minutes." Morrow was at a back table when Lena arrived, with a cup of coffee she'd barely touched, and a small notebook she closed when Lena sat down. "No recording," Lena said. "I don't record without consent." She said it simply, without offense. "I never have." Lena studied her for a second. Then she said, "You called Creed a problem. 4 stories you couldn't get to print. What was the common factor that killed them each time?" Morrow's eyes sharpened. "Sourcing. Every time I had something solid, the supporting sources would back out. One of them moved. One stopped returning calls. One recanted under what I'm fairly certain was pressure, though I couldn't prove it. Were the recantations voluntary?" A pause that confirmed the answer before she gave it. "In form. Not in anything I could demonstrate," Lena said. Morrow didn't react visibly. She was good at that. "I know that name." "How?" "He appeared on my radar 3 years ago when I was working on the second story. He'd been listed as a consultant for a municipal contract that ran through the county seat. I couldn't connect him to Creed directly, so it stayed in the file." "Connect him now," Lena said. "Off your own record. Not because I told you. You're telling me he's the reason my sources. I'm telling you to look at him and let what you find tell you what you need to know." She kept her eyes level. "I can't give you anything. I want to be very clear about that. I cannot be a source. I cannot confirm. I cannot point you toward anything that didn't come from your own reporting." Morrow was quiet for a long moment. "But I'm right that there's something here." It wasn't really a question. Lena didn't answer it. "There's a piece in the dispatch this morning," she said instead. "Under Callan Fitch's byline. I saw it. I didn't write it, and I wasn't consulted." Something moved across Morrow's face that looked like anger she'd had enough practice with to keep contained. "Fitch handles municipal coverage. He got a call from above editorial yesterday afternoon. The piece was filed and approved in under 3 hours, which is not normal for anything with legal exposure. Your editor got a call from Plunkett," Lena said. Morrow was still for about 2 seconds. "You know that? Look at Plunkett's Thursday afternoon. Look at the call log." "I can't subpoena a call log." "No. But the timing is verifiable if you know where to look, and you've been doing this for 11 years. She pulled her jacket from the chair back and stood. "Don't contact me. Don't mention this conversation to anyone. When what you find is solid enough to be solid, you'll know what to do with it." Morrow looked up at her. "Why are you doing this?" It was a reasonable question. Lena thought about how to answer it honestly, without saying anything she couldn't take back. "Because you've been trying to get the truth out of this county for 11 years, she said. That shouldn't have been that hard. She left a 20 on the table for the coffee she hadn't ordered and walked out into the gray Kemper morning. The call that changed the shape of everything came at 2:15 that afternoon. It came from a number she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't answer it. And then something at the edge of her awareness, the quality of the repetition, some small calculated thing she couldn't name, made her pick up. Ms. Vasek. Male voice, older, precise in the way that suggested someone who chose words deliberately. My name is Randolph Oates. I'm an attorney. I represent a client who would prefer to remain unnamed at this time. My client has information relevant to the investigation that has been the subject of your recent difficulties. She said nothing. Let him continue. My client is a former member of the Grover County Sheriff's Department. He left the department 14 months ago. He has been in contact with no law enforcement bodies since that time. A pause. He contacted me last week, after the Highway 9 incident. He said that watching what you did on that highway specifically, watching it on the footage that the county EMS unit filed with their incident report, he decided that you were the right person to give what he has to. What does he have? She said carefully. Documentation. Originals. He has been holding them for 14 months. Another pause that had weight in it. He recorded several conversations inside the department. Ms. Vasek. Digital recordings with date and timestamp authentication. He has a chain of custody he maintained himself. He is not a legally sophisticated man, but he was careful because he was frightened, and careful is sometimes sufficient. She sat down. Why didn't he go to federal authorities? Because 14 months ago, he didn't trust that the federal process would protect him before it exposed him. He watched what happened to the two witnesses in the civil rights case. The attorney's voice was level and without judgment. He made a calculation. It may not have been the correct one. He's aware of that. What do the recordings contain? A pause longer than the others. They contain, among other things, a conversation between Sheriff Creed and Deputy Holt discussing the suppression of a specific incident report. They contain a conversation between Sheriff Creed and a man my client identifies as Warren Selk, discussing the management of what Selk refers to as the county's exposure window. And they contain a conversation in which Sheriff Creed explicitly discusses the two civil rights witnesses by name and what he expects to happen to their testimony. The room was very quiet. 14 months. This man had been holding this for 14 months, sitting with it in whatever house he lived in, carrying it while she'd been building her case from the ground up without knowing it existed. Your client needs to come forward formally, she said, through a protected channel. Today if possible, tomorrow at the latest. That's why he contacted me. He's prepared to do that. But he wants assurance. He'll have it. She was already calculating who to call. Give me 2 hours. Don't let him contact anyone else. Keep his phone in a location that isn't his home tonight. Pause. You're taking this seriously. I'm taking it very seriously. She kept her voice controlled. What's your client's name? Doyle Mabry. He was a patrol deputy for 6 years before he left. She wrote the name down. 2 hours, Mr. Oates. She hung up and called Fane. Fane answered on the second ring, which was unusual. She skipped the preamble. Doyle Mabry. Former Creed deputy, 14 months out. He has recorded conversations, Creed and Holt on report suppression, Creed and Selk discussing what sounds like explicit case management strategy, and Creed on the civil rights witnesses. She paused. Authenticated digital recordings with chain of custody. The silence on Fane's end lasted exactly 4 seconds. How did you find him? He found me. Through an attorney named Randolph Oates. After Highway 9. Vasek, I know how it looks. But the attorney called me. I didn't seek this out. And if Mabry's material is what his attorney says it is, if it's authenticated and the chain of custody holds, it's the center of the case, Fane said. And there was something underneath his voice that wasn't quite emotion, but was adjacent to it, the sound of someone who'd been working something for a long time and had just heard the piece they'd needed land into place. He needs a protected channel, and he needs it tonight, she said. If Selk has any indication this man exists, he may already. Her hand tightened on the phone. How much? We've been running the Selk intercepts since this morning. There's a communication from yesterday evening, before you called me, that references a loose end. No name. But the timing, and the fact that it was sent from a location in Grover County. Find Mabry tonight, she said. Not tomorrow, tonight. I'm already moving. A short pause, Vasek. Don't go anywhere tonight that isn't your house. I wasn't planning to. She hung up and sat in the silence of the kitchen and thought about a man named Doyle Mabry, who had spent 14 months being frightened and careful and had watched a highway accident on a county EMS report and decided that she was the right person. She hoped she was the right person. At 5:30 p.m., her phone buzzed with a message from Marsh. Mabry is secured. Attorney is cooperating. Material is with Fane. Preliminary authentication looks strong. She let herself breathe for a moment. Then one more thing. Selk is in the county. Arrived this afternoon. Vehicle registered to same holding company. She stood up from the table and went to the window. The street was quiet. The afternoon light was doing what it did in late spring, coming in low and long, making everything look slightly more significant than it probably was. A neighbor's dog was moving at the far end of the road. A car she recognized passed going south toward town, and then a second car, slower, that she didn't recognize. Dark-colored sedan, not the SUV from before, moving past her house at a pace that was slightly too deliberate for a residential street. It didn't stop. She stayed at the window for a few minutes after it passed. Selk was in the county, Mabry was secured, Fane had the recordings. The case had just become, in the space of a single afternoon, something significantly more complete than it had been that morning, which meant the next 12 hours were the most dangerous they'd been since she'd arrived in Harwick Crossing. She drew the kitchen curtain and went through the house, doing what she needed to do. Not from fear, fear was a reaction, and she'd trained herself out of unmanaged reactions years ago. From the clear-eyed assessment that the situation had moved into a different phase, and the phase required different preparation. She checked the locks. She checked the safe. She composed a secure message to Fane with a location and a secondary location and a tertiary, and sent it. Then she sat at the kitchen table and waited, and thought about Mabry and his 14 months of fear and the thing he'd done with it, and about the way the word courage almost never looked the way people expected it to look, and almost never came from the direction they were watching. Her phone lit up with a message from a number she didn't have stored. She opened it. One line. No name. No explanation of who had sent it or how they had her number. He knows what you are. She stared at the 3 words for a long moment. Then she put the phone face down on the table, very deliberately, and the kitchen was quiet, and the question she'd written at the top of the legal pad the night before had finally answered itself. But the answer had opened something she hadn't fully planned for, and somewhere in Grover County, Warren Selk was making decisions about the next 12 hours that she would have to be ready for. The curtain moved slightly at the kitchen window. Not from wind. There was no wind. She moved to the side of the window before she touched the curtain. Old habit. You didn't stand in front of a window when something had moved it without cause. You stepped to the wall, to the edge, and you looked from there. She pressed her back to the kitchen wall and reached across with 2 fingers and drew the curtain back an inch. The side yard was empty. The gate to the back was closed, the way she'd left it. The neighbor's fence line was undisturbed. The light was going fast now, that specific late spring dimming that happened in under 20 minutes and left the kind of dark that made distances unreliable. Nothing moved. She held the position for a full minute. Then she dropped the curtain, crossed the kitchen to the back door, and checked the deadbolt and the chain and the secondary lock she'd installed herself in her first week on Cutter Road, and did the same at the front. And then she stood in the narrow hallway between the two and thought clearly about what she knew. The curtain had moved. There was no crossbreeze. She'd checked the windows an hour ago, and all of them were locked. Old houses settled and shifted, but this house had specific sounds for that, and a curtain moving was not one of them, which left either something she'd missed in her assessment of the exterior, or something as simple as the pressure change from the back door deadbolt engaging when she'd thrown it. She decided it was the deadbolt. She decided that because the alternative required her to do something operationally significant tonight that she didn't have authorization for, and because Fane had told her to stay inside, and because the text "He knows what you are" had been designed to make her move, and moving was what she was not going to do. She was going to sit in this house and let the case that had spent the last several hours assembling itself continue to assemble. She made tea she didn't want, and sat at the kitchen table and stayed there until midnight. Nobody came, called at 6 a.m. She was already up, had been since 5, and when she answered his voice had the particular flatness of someone who had also been awake for a long time and had stopped noticing it. Mabry's recordings authenticated, he said. We had 2 independent analysts work through the night. Chain of custody is solid. He'd stored them on an encrypted drive, hadn't altered the metadata, had a handwritten log of every time he accessed the files with dates and times. A pause. He was meticulous. For someone who was, by his own description, terrified for 14 months, he was extremely meticulous. She thought about Doyle Mabry, a patrol deputy she'd never met, sitting somewhere with a drive he didn't fully trust himself to protect, and a log he'd been keeping, because he had nothing else to do with the fear except try to make it useful. What's on them, she said. Enough. Fane's voice didn't shift, but something in the word did. The Creed-Holt conversation is explicit. Creed instructs Holt to pull the Garfield use of force report from the county filing system and reroute it to a personal file that Creed controls. He specifies the report number. He specifies where it goes. Holt confirms that conversation alone is obstruction. And the Selk recording? A longer pause this time. Selk's voice is on it. We've done a preliminary voice match against public recordings of his state police testimony from 9 years ago. It's him. Fain paused again. In the recording, Selk tells Creed, and I'm going to read this from the transcript, that the exposure window can be managed, as long as the principal documentation is controlled and the witness pipeline stays closed. He then references two names, the two civil rights complainants, the witness pipeline. She wrote it down, though she'd remember it without writing it. He uses those words, she said. Witness pipeline? Verbatim. Which tells us this is not his first time having this conversation with someone. Fain took a breath. We're moving to a formal warrant stage. I have authorization as of 1 hour ago. But there's a sequencing issue. Selk is in the county, she said. Yes. And if we move on Creed first, Selk has time to create distance. He's done it before in the second county. When the formal inquiry started, he'd removed himself from documented contact with the client department 3 weeks before the filing. We think he has a protocol for this. So you need to move on both simultaneously. We need to move on both simultaneously, and to do that cleanly, we need one more thing. He paused. We need someone who can place Selk in active coordination with Creed within the last 72 hours. Not historical. Current. It tightens the conspiracy charge, and it removes the distance argument. She already knew what he was going to say before he said it. You can't use Mabry for that, she said. His material is 14 months old. No. And surveillance footage from the SUV passes isn't going to. It establishes presence. It doesn't establish coordination. He stopped. Vasek. Adele Morrow. She was quiet. She's been watching this county for 11 years, he said. If she has anything in her files that puts Selk and Creed in direct contact, documented, verifiable, her own reporting. She told me she had him in a file from 3 years ago. A municipal consulting contract. That's not current. I know. But she's been watching. If she's seen anything in the last week. I can't go to her, Lena said, not for something that feeds directly into a federal warrant. That's using a journalist as an investigative resource. That's a line I won't cross. I'm not asking you to cross it. I'm asking you to tell me whether there's a legal, ethical pathway through her that I'm not seeing. She thought about it. Not quickly. She thought about what Morrow had said in the Kemper diner, about 4 unprinted stories and recanted sources and 11 years of accumulation. She thought about what Morrow had said about the Fitch piece, about knowing it wasn't right, about the way her jaw had tensed when she mentioned Plunkett's call to her editor. She's going to publish something, Lena said, on her own timeline for her own reasons. If what she publishes is factually useful, then it's in the public record and we can reference it. You'd need it published before the warrant stage. I need it in the next 6 hours, he said. She picked up her jacket. She called Morrow from the truck, parked outside her own house watching the street. I need to know if you're ready to publish, she said, when Morrow picked up. A short on Creed? On Selk. Specifically, if you have anything current, anything from the last week that puts him in documented contact with Creed or Plunkett. Morrow was quiet for a moment. That felt like it had calculation in it. I followed up on what you said about Plunkett's Thursday. Couldn't get the call log directly, but I have a source in Plunkett's office, separate from everything else, who confirmed a meeting took place. In person, 4:45 p.m., and I have a photo. Lena's hand tightened on the steering wheel. From your source? From a security camera on the building across from Plunkett's office. I've been building a relationship with the building manager for 8 months for an unrelated story. He let me look at Thursday's footage, a pause. The photo shows Creed's vehicle outside Plunkett's building at 4:40. And it shows a second vehicle, a dark sedan. Partial plate arriving 4 minutes later. Dark sedan. Not the SUV, the car that had passed her house at 5:30 p.m. Morrow, she said carefully. Are you ready to publish? I've been ready to publish something in this county for 3 years. There was no bitterness in it. Just fact. I need 30 minutes to make the call to my editor. Your editor got a call from Plunkett. My editor is also a man who has worked in journalism for 25 years and doesn't enjoy being used. When I show him what I have, he's going to make the right call. She paused. He usually does. Plunkett caught him at a weak moment, and he didn't push back. He's been irritated about that since yesterday. 30 minutes, Lena said. 25, Morrow said, and hung up. The story posted to the Dispatch's website at 8:47 a.m. It ran under Morrow's byline, and the headline was not careful at all. Private consultant, with history of shielding misconduct investigations, linked to Grover County officials. It was 1,200 words, sourced to a county office contact, photographic evidence, 3 years of corporate record research, and the building manager's camera footage described in legally precise terms. It named Warren Selk by full name, described his firm, listed the 3 prior counties, and documented the Thursday meeting with Plunkett. It did not mention Creed directly. It didn't need to. By 9:15, Fain had it. By 9:40, the warrant stage began. She heard about the arrests, the way she heard about most things that happened at a distance in pieces, from multiple directions, none of them complete. Fain called at 11:30 and said simply, "We have Creed. Holt is in processing. Selk's attorney is already filing," which we expected. Plunkett? Being interviewed. He's cooperating. A pause with something almost like dry humor in it, enthusiastically cooperating. He has been for about 40 minutes. She was sitting in the diner in Kemper where she'd met Morrow, because she'd needed to be somewhere that wasn't her house, and because the coffee here was adequate, and the booth in the back was private. "What's the formal charge structure?" she said. "Creed, obstruction, evidence tampering, civil rights violations under federal statute, 3 counts. Holt, conspiracy, obstruction. Selk, federal conspiracy. Witness intimidation. 2 counts of suborning obstruction." He listed them with the precision of someone who'd drafted them. "The civil rights complainants have been contacted. Both of them. One is willing to come forward immediately. The second is considering it." She thought about the 2 people who'd filed those complaints and watched their testimony dissolve around them, and about what it cost a person to do something like that twice. "They need support infrastructure before they make that call," she said. "Pressure." Agreed. "We have a victim's advocate from the regional office making contact today." Good. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "The Dispatch Piece Morrow filed it independently. You had no involvement in its production, you provided no information, and you made no contact that could be characterized as coordination. That's clean." A pause. "She's a good reporter. She's a very good reporter," Lena said. "She's been trying to be one in a county that was actively working against her for 11 years. The line was quiet for a moment. "Your suspension," Fain said. "We'll be in contact with the medical center formally this afternoon. The basis for the complaint against you is gone with Creed's arrest, and the administrator will be informed that the suspension was initiated under false pretenses." "Okay. You could push for more than reinstatement. Publicly, if you wanted to. I don't want to." "I know." He sounded like he'd expected that answer. "Vasek, this one mattered. I want you to know that. What Mabry had, what you built in 14 months, the way this morning came together." He stopped in when he was approaching something he didn't have a professional frame for. "It mattered. Tell Mabry that," she said. He did the hard part. She hung up and sat with her coffee and the particular flatness that came after something ended. The formal public hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. She wasn't asked to attend. Then she was asked to attend in an official capacity, which was a different thing with different requirements. Fain called on Monday to tell her that the county had requested a federal representative be present and that her name had been submitted in that capacity by the regional office, and that she had the right to decline. She thought about it for about 4 seconds. "I'll be there," she said. She spent the days before it doing what she'd been doing for 14 months, minus the active operational component. She checked on Harold Breck's oxygen concentrator and found it was running properly now, but that Harold himself was having a bad week with his breathing. So she stayed an extra hour and made sure he had what he needed and left him with her number and instructions to use it. She ran her road in the mornings. She fixed the tomato cages that had needed fixing since October. She made barley soup for Doris without being asked and brought it over on a Tuesday evening and sat at Doris's kitchen table for 2 hours in the comfortable silence of people who'd been through something together and didn't need to account for all of it. "You're staying," Doris said eventually. It wasn't quite a question. "For now," Lena said, which was more honest than yes. Doris nodded and didn't push it. On Wednesday evening, the night before the hearing, she went to see Doyle Mabry. He lived in a rented house in the south part of the county, a small place with a truck in the driveway and a porch that needed work, which felt appropriate in a way she couldn't quite articulate. He was 43, she'd learned, with a face that looked like it had worried itself, a few years older than that. He opened the door before she knocked, which meant he'd been watching for her. "Ms. Vac," he said. "Lena," she said, "can I come in?" He stepped back. The inside of the house was tidy in the way of someone who'd stopped owning many things. There was a coffee maker on the counter and a book face down on the couch, and not much else visible. She sat when he gestured toward the couch, and he sat across from her in a kitchen chair he'd turned around. "Fain told me you were the one who got the attorney to reach out," he said. "No, you found the attorney. That was you. I mean that you were the reason He stopped. "Tried again. After Highway 9, I saw the EMS report footage. What you did out there." He looked at his hands. I'd been sitting with that drive for 14 months. I'd taken it out maybe a dozen times and then put it back and told myself the timing wasn't right. And then I watched you run that scene, and I thought, exhaled. I thought if she's still doing it, I can do this one thing. She looked at him for a moment. You did more than one thing, she said. What you held on to, it's the center of the case. Without that, we have a circumstantial file and a long timeline. With it, we have them. He nodded slowly. He didn't look relieved exactly. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something and had set it down and was still figuring out what his body felt like without the weight. Will they try to come at me, he said. Selk's attorneys. They'll try to challenge the chain of custody. Fane's team is prepared for that. She paused. You'll be deposed, it'll be uncomfortable. But you were careful, and careful holds up. I wasn't sure it would. He looked at his hands again. I'm not sure I was doing it right. I just wrote down everything and kept the log, because I didn't know what else to do. Doing it right and doing what you could with what you had aren't always different things, she said. He was quiet for a while. Outside, the spring evening was settling into the particular blue that came before full dark, and it came through his window at an angle that made the room look softer than it probably was. What happens to you now, he said, after this? I go back to work, she said. Just like that? Just like that. He looked at her, like he was trying to figure out whether she was telling the whole truth about that, and she let him look, because she wasn't sure herself. The hearing was held in the Grover County Municipal Building, in a room that seated about 60 and had 73 people in it by the time it started. She arrived early, which was her nature, and stood at the back of the room while it filled. She recognized faces from the hospital, from the neighborhood, from the accident scene. She recognized the two civil rights complainants, a woman in her 40s named Darlene Ocha, who'd come from 2 counties away, and a man named Preston Galt, who'd driven back from wherever he'd gone when the testimony had fallen apart. They were sitting separately, which told her they hadn't spoken yet, and she thought about introducing them later and decided to let that happen in its own time. Was there in the 3rd row, with a notebook, and the look of someone who was finally going to be able to print something she'd been trying to print for a long time. Fane came in with 2 members of his team and sat at the federal representative table and looked at her once across the room with the specific expressionlessness that meant he was glad she was there. Creed was not present. He was in federal custody, and his attorney had filed and lost a motion to delay. Holt was similarly absent. Selk's attorney was present at a separate table, with the careful posture of someone who had done this before and knew how to wait out a long day. The county council opened the proceedings. The federal statement was read into the record by Fane's colleague charges, evidence summary, warrant documentation, the formal articulation of what had been found and how. It was dense and procedural, and the room listened to all of it with a silence that had texture to it, the kind of silence that people produce when they're hearing out loud what they suspected privately for years. She was called to the podium at 11:15. She'd been told she would be asked to speak to her role in the investigation and to the events of the preceding 2 weeks. She'd been given no parameters beyond that, which was either a courtesy or a test. She stood at the podium and looked at the room. 73 people. Some she knew, some she didn't. The 2 complainants in their separate seats. Doris 4 rows back, sitting very straight. I'm Lena Vasek, she said. I'm an ER nurse at Grover County Medical Center. Before that, I was a United States Army combat medic, and before my clinical work, I served with a federal operations unit focused on public corruption investigations. She let that sit for 1 beat because rooms needed to process information in sequence, and she'd learned not to rush them. I've been in Harwick Crossing for 14 months. I was here to investigate the conduct of the Grover County Sheriff's Department. I was here because there were people who needed that investigation done, and I was in a position to do it, and so I did. She looked at Darlene Ocha and then at Preston Galt. I want to be clear about something, she said. The investigation succeeded because of people who were not me. It succeeded because Doyle Mabry held something difficult for 14 months, because he was trying to do the right thing with the tools he had. It's succeeded because Adela Morrow spent 11 years reporting in a county that was making her work as hard as possible. And it succeeded because 2 people sat in this county with their names attached to a complaint they filed, because they believed it was worth filing, and then had to watch it fall apart around them. And came back anyway. She paused. That's what it took. Not me, all of that. The room was very quiet. Fane's colleague asked her 2 formal questions about the evidentiary chain, which she answered precisely. The county council asked about the suspension, and she explained the basis and its connection to Creed's operational strategy. Selk's attorney asked, in the careful language of someone probing for a weak point, whether her undercover status constituted a form of fraud on the community she'd entered. She looked at him. "I was a nurse," she said. "I'm still a nurse. I took care of every patient I was assigned to and several I wasn't. The role was real. What I did in it was real." She let a half-beat pass. "The fraud was in the sheriff's department. I was here to find it." Selk's attorney sat down. After the formal portion ended, there was a recess that turned into something more like a sustained gathering, people talking, finding each other, the kind of human reorganization that happened when a thing that had been held compressed finally had room to expand. She stood at the edge of it for a while. Darlene Ocha found her before she found a way out. The woman was composed in the careful way of someone who'd had to be composed for a long time, and she stood about 3 feet from Lena and looked at her steadily. "I filed that complaint 3 years ago," she said. "After that, after the way it went, I didn't think it was ever going to be anything." "I know," Lena said. "Did you know about me?" "When you were here. I knew about the complaint, about what happened to it. That was part of why I was here." Darlene was quiet for a moment. "You were in the county for 14 months, and you didn't reach out to me." "I couldn't. Not without risking the investigation." She held the woman's eyes. That was the hardest part. Darlene looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, "Did they tell you I almost didn't come today?" "No, I almost didn't." She looked away briefly, then back. "I'm glad I am too," Lena said. She was in the parking lot, headed for her truck, when Fane fell into step beside her. "Well done," he said. "It went the way it needed to go." The administrator from the medical center was in the back of the room. Arrived about 20 minutes in. He glanced at her. "Your badge access will be restored by end of business today." "Good, there's something else." He stopped walking, which made her stop. "Selk's attorney filed a motion this morning before the hearing that we've been sitting on until we could assess it. Selk is claiming that his client engagement with Creed was legitimate consulting and that any communication references were taken out of context." A pause. His attorney is also asserting that Mabry's recordings may have been obtained in violation of the state's two-party consent statute. She looked at Fane. "Were they?" "It's a gray area. Mabry made the recordings in shared spaces, the department common areas, not in private conversations. The relevant case law supports the recordings as legal, but it's not airtight. So Selk's attorney is going to make it about the recordings. He's going to try." Fane looked at her steadily. "But the recordings aren't our only evidentiary thread anymore. We have Plunkett's cooperation, we have the dispatch piece, and the documentation Morrow developed independently. We have the physical surveillance material and the financial trail we've been building on the firm." He paused. "The case holds. Then why are you telling me this?" He looked at her in the way. He looked at her when he was going to say something she might not want to hear. "Because Selk asked to speak with you." She went still. "His attorney made the request this morning. Selk wants a conversation not recorded, not in any formal proceeding with the investigator who was running the Creed case." Fane's voice was completely neutral. "He knows who you are now, your federal role, your background, your involvement. He's trying to assess what we have," she said. "Almost certainly. But he's also—" Fane stopped. The attorney used the phrase material cooperation. "Selk may be preparing to offer something. On who?" Fane held her gaze. "Apparently there are other counties, other clients. He's been doing this in various forms for a long time, and what he has on the other engagements, he let it sit there. His attorney says it's significant." She looked at the municipal building behind them, where the hearing was still unwinding, where Darlene Ocha and Preston Galt were somewhere in the same room, where Doyle Mabry's 14 months of fear had just been entered into the formal record of a legal proceeding that would carry weight. And then she thought about other counties, other departments, other people who'd filed complaints that went somewhere they weren't supposed to go, who'd withdrawn testimony they shouldn't have had to withdraw, who'd left places they shouldn't have had to leave. She thought about that for about 30 seconds. "Tell his attorney I'll hear what he has to say," she said. Fane nodded slowly. "There's one more thing. Selk asked for the meeting to happen today this afternoon. He's proposing a specific location, neutral ground," his attorney's framing. Fane reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He gave an address. She took the paper and unfolded it. The address was a coffee house on the county line in Kemper. She looked at it for a long moment. The same town where she'd met Morrow. The same Route 7 diner, different building, same road, same town. Which was either coincidence or wasn't. She didn't know enough about Selk's knowledge of her movements to determine which. "He picked this address specifically," she said. "His attorney says he suggested it was a neutral location equidistant from. He picked it specifically." She folded the paper. "He knows I've been to Kemper in the last week." Fane looked at her. and the look had something in it that she recognized the recalibration that happened when a situation expanded past its previous edges. If he's been tracking your movements, he started. Then he has more infrastructure than we've mapped. She felt the pieces land in order, the way they did when something she'd almost understood finally finished forming. Fane, the other counties, the other clients. She looked at him. How many are we talking about? He was quiet for a moment. His attorney said 7, he said. 7 separate county-level departments. Over a 9-year period, 7. She thought about the scale of that, the sustained architecture of it, the number of Darlene Okas and Preston Galtz distributed across 7 counties who had encountered the same system and had no way of knowing it was a system. Set the meeting, she said. 2 hours. But I want full surveillance on the location before I go in, and I want Marsh running a trace on every communication Selk's attorney makes between now and then. I can do that. And Fane, she looked at him directly. If he picked that location because he knows I've been to Kemper, and he knows I've been to Kemper because he was tracking me, then there's a 4th thread in his network that we haven't found yet. Someone in the county who was watching you and reporting to him. Someone who isn't Creed and isn't Plunkett and isn't any of the deputies. She held the folded paper. Someone we haven't looked at. Fane was very still for a moment. Go to the meeting, he said quietly. I'll start running the 4th thread now. She nodded and walked to her truck, and behind her the spring afternoon was ordinary and bright, and entirely indifferent to what was moving through it. And the address in her hand was a location that a man had chosen for reasons she needed to understand before she walked through the door. And somewhere between here and that coffee house in Kemper was the last piece of something that had been 11 years in the building, and 14 months in the finishing. She needed to be ready for whatever Warren Selk was actually offering. Because in her experience, men who wanted to cooperate on their own terms always had something they were protecting more carefully than what they were surrendering, and she was not going to walk into that room without knowing what it was. She got in the truck. She had 2 hours. She drove the 40 minutes to Kemper without music, without the radio, without anything except the road, and whatever her mind needed to do with what it had. The 2 hours she'd asked Fane for wasn't really 2 hours. It was the drive there and back, and whatever happened in the middle. And she used the first 20 minutes to work through what she knew about Warren Selk in the way she worked through things when the stakes were high enough that being wrong carried a cost she wasn't willing to pay. 9 years. 7 counties. A former state police officer who had, at some point in the space between his legitimate career and his current one, made a calculation about what he was good at and what the market for it looked like. She'd known men like that. Not many, but enough to understand the internal logic of it, the way a certain kind of operational competence, in the wrong direction, stopped feeling like corruption and started feeling like craft, like expertise applied to an available problem. That was the part she needed to keep in front of her. Selk wasn't offering cooperation because he'd developed a conscience. He was offering it because the architecture of his position had collapsed in the last 24 hours, and cooperation was the tool he had left. She needed to know what he was protecting before she could evaluate what he was surrendering. Marsh called at the 40-minute mark when she was pulling into Kemper. 4th thread, Marsh said. We ran the communication intercepts from the last 10 days and cross-referenced with Selk's known network. We found it. Who? Deputy Pruitt, Marsh said. 8 months with the department. He was Selk's access point inside the building, not Creed's man originally Selk's. He was placed in the department. She thought about the young deputy who'd brought her water in the processing room, who'd stood in the doorway looking uncertain and told her he'd been there 8 months and that it was good work. The way he'd turned back when she asked his name, surprised by the question, like he hadn't expected her to be the kind of person who asked. He was 20-something, and he'd been placed there by a man running a 9-year operation across 7 counties. Is he in custody, she said. As of 30 minutes ago. He's being interviewed. Marsh paused. He's not handling it well. I think he's younger than Selk's typical contact. I think he may not have fully understood what he was part of. That tracked. That was how those operations worked. You didn't tell the peripheral pieces what the whole picture looked like. You gave them a job description and a plausible reason, and enough proximity to power that they felt like they were on the right side of something. Tell Fane, she said. Already done. She parked on the street outside the coffee house and sat in the truck for a moment. Pruitt. 8 months. He'd been there almost exactly as long as she had. She got out and went in. Selk was at a corner table, which she'd expected people with operational instincts always took corners. He was smaller than she'd imagined, which was also not unusual. The men who built the largest machinery were rarely physically imposing. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, with the squared-off posture of someone who'd worn a uniform for a long time and never quite let go of it. His attorney, a precise-looking woman in her 50s, sat to his left with a legal pad and a pen she wasn't using yet. A federal observer sat at a table by the door. She'd clocked him on the way in. Fane had placed him before she arrived. She sat across from Selk without being invited to, which was deliberate, and he registered it. "Miss Vasek," he said. His voice was measured, the voice of someone accustomed to controlling the pace of a conversation. "Mr. Selk." She put nothing in her voice either. "Your attorney indicated you had something material to offer. I'm here to hear it." He looked at her for a moment, with the particular attention of someone taking a real assessment. Not hostile, not performative. Actually looking. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "You're doing what I expected," she said, starting with an observation that reframes me. "I'd rather we didn't." His attorney made a small note on the legal pad. Selk almost smiled, not warmly, with something closer to recognition. "All right. I'll be direct, please. The 7 counties your colleague mentioned. The number is accurate, but the characterization isn't complete." He folded his hands on the table. "It's not 7 separate engagements. It's a network. The departments I've consulted for are connected to each other through a shared municipal funding structure that runs through the state capital. The money that funds the departments, and that funds my firm, comes from the same allocation channel." She kept her face still. "You're telling me the corruption isn't county level," she said. "I'm telling you that what you prosecuted this morning is the floor, not the ceiling." He held her gaze. "Creed is the floor. What's above him is considerably larger and considerably more entrenched." "Who's above him?" He looked at his attorney, who gave one small nod. "There's a state-level administrator named Orville Kessler. He manages the municipal safety allocation budget for 6 counties, including Grover. He has been directing funding to departments in exchange for operational cooperation, meaning those departments handle certain situations in certain ways when asked to." He paused. "I was brought in to manage the exposure when the handling created liability. Kessler is the one who referred Creed to my firm." She sat with that, Orville Kessler, a name she didn't have. A state-level administrator sitting above 7 counties' worth of managed misconduct, who had been invisible in everything she'd built over 14 months because she'd been looking at the floor. "You have documentation of Kessler's involvement?" she said. "I have a great deal of documentation," he said. "Communications, financial records, a specific directive from Kessler to my firm dated 3 years ago that constitutes, in my attorney's assessment, sufficient evidence to open a state-level criminal inquiry. Why are you giving this to me?" He was quiet for a moment. The first real pause, the kind that had something actual behind it, rather than strategy. "Because what's happening to Creed is going to happen to me regardless," he said. "My attorney has been very clear about that. The question is what form it takes and what comes out of it." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "But also, she said, the thing I built, I was good at it. I was very good at it for 9 years, and I told myself it was a service. That departments needed management resources, and I provided them. That I was solving a problem." He looked at her with something in his face that wasn't remorse exactly, but was in the same neighborhood. "Watching what happened in that hearing room this morning." He stopped again. "Darlene Ocha was there. I know who she is. I know the complaint she filed. I know what happened to it." A pause. "I know that I'm part of what happened to it." She didn't say anything. She let him sit in it because it was his to sit in. "I'm offering what I have," he said. "All of it. On Kessler, on the network, on the funding structure. In exchange for consideration at sentencing, which my attorney will formalize with your federal team." "I'm not the one who makes that agreement," she said. "That goes through the prosecutor's office." "I know. I'm asking you to carry it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Give your documentation to my colleague at the door," she said. "I'll make sure the right people see it today." She stood. "Mr. Selk, the consideration you receive at sentencing will reflect what you provide and how completely you provide it. Don't hold anything back thinking you can use it later. That calculation has a way of going wrong." He looked up at her. "I wasn't planning to." She believed him, which surprised her slightly. Then she thought about Pruitt, placed in Creed's department at 20-something, with an incomplete picture of what he was serving, and about the other people in other counties who'd been peripheral pieces of this without knowing the shape of the whole thing, and she thought that the machinery Selk had built had been self-sustaining enough that maybe even the man who built it had eventually lost track of the edges of it. She left him sitting at the corner table and walked back out into the Kemper afternoon. She called Fain from the parking lot. Orville Kessler, she said. State-level municipal safety administrator. He's the referral source for Selk's firm, and the funding structure runs through him. Selk has documentation. The silence on Fain's end had a different quality than his usual silences. Say that name again, he said. She did. We have a threat on Kessler, Fain said slowly. We've had it for about 18 months. It's been sitting in a separate case file because we couldn't connect him to anything specific. We had the money movement, but we didn't have the mechanism. Selk is the mechanism, she said. Selk is the mechanism, Fain repeated. Vasek, if the documentation holds, you need to move on Kessler before he hears about Selk's cooperation. How fast can you get a warrant if the documentation is what Selk says it is? She could hear him calculating. 6 hours, maybe 5. Make it 4, she said. He's a state administrator. He has state-level resources, which means he has better information flow than a county sheriff. He's going to hear something. 4 hours, Fain said. Go home, Vasek. I'm going home, she said. She drove back to Harwick Crossing with the windows down, which she didn't usually do, and the spring air came through in a way that smelled like cut grass and something else she couldn't name, something that was specific to this particular stretch of county highway at this particular time of year, and she drove it at a speed that was slightly below the limit and paid attention to it in a way that she hadn't paid attention to the landscape in a long time. Orville Kessler was arrested at his state capitol office at 6:47 p.m. She learned that from a news alert that hit her phone while she was standing in her kitchen, making dinner, actually making it this time, with ingredients she'd bought on the way home, because she'd realized she had nothing in the house except condiments and a partial bag of rice. The alert was from the dispatch. Morrow's byline. She read it while the onion she'd been cutting sat on the board and went slightly translucent at the edges. The piece was 400 words, tight and precise, and it named Kessler and his title, and the federal charges and the connection to the Grover County investigation. It quoted an unnamed federal source as saying the arrest was connected to a broader pattern of corruption spanning multiple counties and multiple years. At the bottom in the last paragraph, Morrow had written one additional line. The investigation that surfaced the network began with the wrongful arrest of an ER nurse in a Harwick Crossing diner on March 14th. She put the phone face down and finished making dinner. The days that followed had the particular texture of aftermath, not quiet exactly, but a different kind of noise. Procedural noise, administrative noise, the noise of things being formally addressed that had needed addressing for a long time. The medical center reinstated her on a Friday with a letter from Administrator Fenn that was 3 paragraphs of careful professional language, wrapping a single substantive sentence. The suspension had been without valid basis, and her standing with the institution was fully restored. He signed it himself, which she took as the maximum amount of accountability a man like Fenn was capable of generating, and she accepted it in that spirit. Her first shift back was a Tuesday. She arrived 12 minutes early, which was her habit, and she went to the locker room and changed into scrubs. And she walked out onto the floor, and it was exactly as she'd left it, the controlled chaos of an emergency room in a rural county hospital that was understaffed relative to its caseload, and nevertheless kept moving, because the people in it were the kind of people who kept moving. Doris found her between patients in the hallway outside exam room 3 and said nothing. Just put one hand briefly on Lena's arm and kept walking. That was sufficient. 3 weeks after the hearing, she got a call from a federal prosecutor named Hadley, who was managing the consolidated case, Creed, Holt, Selk, Kessler, and 4 additional individuals identified through Selk's documentation and the Kessler investigation. Hadley was direct and efficient and had the voice of someone who didn't use words unless they were doing specific work. We're at the formal indictment stage on all primary subjects, Hadley said. Creed's attorney has entered a preliminary not guilty plea, which is expected to change. Holt has already entered a cooperation agreement. Selk's documentation on Kessler was a pause that Lena recognized as a prosecutor exercising restraint. It was comprehensive. Kessler's attorney filed a motion to suppress yesterday that's going to fail. What are the formal charges against Kessler? Federal corruption, wire fraud, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and civil rights violations under federal statute, specifically in relation to the management of the OCHA and GALT complaints. Another pause. Those two are formally designated as victims under the indictment structure, which means they have standing in the proceedings. She thought about Darlene Ocha in the hearing room. About the composed, careful quality of someone who'd had to be composed for a long time. Are they aware of that? She said. They were notified this morning. A beat. Ms. Ocha asked me to pass something along to you, if you were willing to receive it. Yes, she said, and I'm reading from my notes. Tell her that coming back was the right choice, even though it was harder than not coming back. Tell her it was worth it. Lena stood at the window of the break room, where she'd taken the call, with the hospital sounds moving around her, the PA system, the wheeled cart going past in the hallway, someone's voice asking a question at the nursing station, and she was quiet for a moment. Tell her I'm glad she came back, she said. The sentencing hearings took place over a 2-month period, and she attended 2 of them. The first was Creed's. He entered the federal courtroom looking smaller than he'd looked in the Dusty Fork Diner on March 14th. Though she understood that was partly the room, and partly the specific diminishment of a man who'd been operating without consequences for 19 years, and was now standing inside the structure of them. His attorney had negotiated a plea agreement which reduced the federal corruption charges to 2 counts in exchange for full disclosure of his operational relationship with Selk. He was sentenced to 11 years. The judge read the sentence, and Creed stood there and received it with the stillness of someone who'd run out of angles. She watched from the gallery, not with satisfaction, exactly, with something more like the recognition of a weight that had been properly accounted for. The thing he'd done to Darlene Ocha, to Preston Galt, to Doyle Mabry, to the unnamed people in his county who'd simply lived under a system he'd spent 19 years making work for himself. All of it had a number attached to it now. The number wasn't the whole of it. It never was. But it was the part that the formal structure of accountability could produce. And she'd been in this work long enough to know that you took what the structure could produce, and you didn't pretend it was everything, and you also didn't pretend it was nothing. 11 years. He'd have been long retired if he'd just done the job. The second hearing was Kessler's, and that one she attended because Hadley had asked her to, not as a formal participant, but as a federal observer, which was a role with specific weight in rooms like that one. Kessler was 61, silver-haired, the kind of man who had been photographed at county budget meetings for 2 decades looking like he belonged there. He had run a funding structure that touched 6 counties and somewhere between 40 and 60 individual misconduct situations over 8 years, the precise number still being determined as the investigation expanded. He received 14 years, which his attorney was already appealing, which everyone in the room expected, and which didn't change the number. What she remembered from that hearing was not the sentence. It was the moment before, when the prosecutor read the count relating to Darlene Ocha's complaint into the formal record and named it as a civil rights violation committed under color of law, and Kessler sat in his chair and looked at the table with the specific blankness of someone who had run out of distance between themselves and the thing they'd done. It was 11 seconds, she counted. In May, she found Doyle Mabry at a community meeting about county oversight reform, a new citizens committee that had formed in the wake of the investigation, focused on building an independent review structure for the department going forward. He was sitting in the 4th row with a notepad he wasn't using, looking like someone who wasn't sure whether he belonged there and had decided to sit down anyway. She took the seat beside him. "You doing okay?" she said. "Better than I was." He glanced at her. "I've been talking to a counselor. The attorney suggested it and He stopped. "It's helping." "Good. I got a job offer," he said. "Security coordinator for a school district in the next county over. It's less than I was making, but it's..." He looked at the front of the room where the committee organizer was setting up. "It feels like a thing I can do without carrying anything." "Then take it," she said. He nodded slowly. "I heard you're staying." "For a while." "Just a while?" She thought about that. About Cutter Road and the garden that was doing better, now that she was actually paying attention to it. About Harold Breck's breathing, which had been more stable since she'd gotten him properly set up with a pulmonologist in the county seat. About Doris and the Thursday breakfasts that had resumed at Dusty Fork at the corner table because neither of them had suggested moving. "For a while is what I know right now," she said. "That's enough." He almost smiled. Is it? You always answer the question you can answer, not the bigger one. She considered that. The bigger one usually works itself out, if you handle the one you can answer. He looked at her for a moment. Is that something they teach you? In the military? No, she said. That one I learned on my own. She was in the diner on a Thursday in early June, the dusty fork, corner table, coffee already poured when a Del Moro came in. Not by arrangement. The way things in small counties happened, by proximity and routine, and the fact that there were only so many places to go on a Thursday morning. And eventually everyone ended up in the same ones. Morrow saw her stopped and then came over. Can I? She nodded at the empty chair across from Lena. Doris is coming, but she'll be 10 minutes late. She always is. Morrow sat. She was carrying a bag that looked heavy with the specific weight of active reporting notebooks, recorder, the physical accumulation of a story in progress. The Kessler expansion, Lena said. You're still on it. 3 more counties identified in the last 2 weeks. There's a 4th that we think connects, but I don't have the sourcing yet. She set the bag down. It's the biggest thing I've covered. It's going to run in parts. The dispatch can't hold it all in one piece. You should pitch it regionally, Lena said. This is bigger than a county paper. Morrow looked at her. I know. My editor said the same thing yesterday. She stopped. It's been 11 years of trying to get things into print in a county that didn't want them in print. Thinking about a larger platform, she paused. It feels strange. Like a step I don't fully trust yet. You've earned it, Lena said simply. Morrow was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been thinking about writing something about you. Not about the investigation, the federal side of that is documented. About what it takes to spend 14 months being someone slightly other than yourself, because it's the thing the work requires. That's not a story I can give you, Lena said. I know. That's not why I'm telling you. Morrow looked at her. I'm telling you because I think someone should say it out loud. What that costs. What it takes. Because when this is all written up in the formal record, it's going to read like a clean operation. Successful investigation. Corruption exposed, charges filed. And it was all those things. She paused. But you were in this county for 14 months and you were careful every day and someone put handcuffs on you in this diner in front of everyone who knew you and you just... She stopped. You just absorbed it. Because the work required it. Lena looked at the table. At the coffee cup, which was the same size and shape as the one that had been in her hand when Creed walked in on March 14th. Absorbing. It was the easier part, she said after a moment. Staying after was the harder one. Why did you? She thought about that honestly, the way she tried to think about things that deserved honest thought. Because I was 14 months in, she said, but also because she started again. Because Mabry was in that county carrying what he was carrying. Because you were here doing what you were doing. Because Darlene Ocha filed that complaint and it went nowhere and she came back anyway. She looked up. I was one piece of it. A useful piece, maybe an important one. But the county was already trying to fix itself. It just needed someone to hold the door open long enough. Morrow looked at her for a long moment. That's the story, she said quietly. Then write it as what it is, Lena said. Not about me. About all of them. The bell above the door announced Doris, who came in slightly breathless and slightly apologetic the way she always did, carrying 2 containers of something she'd apparently baked that morning, and she stopped when she saw Morrow and assessed the table and said, Am I interrupting? No, Lena said. Sit down. There's coffee. In August, the county government formally established the Grover County Independent Oversight Commission. It was a 5-member civilian body with authority to review department conduct, access complaint records, and refer findings to the appropriate legal bodies. The first chair of the commission was a retired judge named Kaspara Weld, who had the specific toughness of someone who'd spent 30 years watching what happened when accountability structures had gaps in them. 2 of the 5 commissioners were Darlene Ocha and Preston Galt. When she heard that, she was in the middle of a pediatric asthma case, a child who was scared and whose mother was more scared, and she was managing both simultaneously the way you did when the patient in front of you needed the room to be calmer than it actually was. She heard it from a coworker who'd seen the announcements on her phone and called it across the nursing station. She finished the case, made sure the child was breathing comfortably, made sure the mother had written instructions and understood them, and felt, if not relaxed, at least less alone with it. Then she stepped into the hallway and allowed herself 30 seconds to think about Darlene Ocha and Preston Galt sitting on the commission that would review the department that had buried their complaint, and about what it meant that the county had put them there, not as token acknowledgement, but with actual authority. 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. The last time she saw Fane was in September. He came to Harwick Crossing, which was unusual. He was not a man who came to places unless there was a reason. He met her at the diner, which was appropriate in a way that neither of them mentioned, and he ordered coffee and didn't drink much of it, and looked like a man who had something to say that didn't have a clean operational frame. The regional office has a new assignment, he said. Different state, different situation. The preliminary is that it's longer than Harwick Crossing, probably 18 months minimum. She looked at her cup. The profile matches yours, he said. The skills, the background, the ability to build something over a long timeline in a contained environment. He paused. You'd be going in as a paramedic this time. Rural county, different structure. Who else has the profile? She said. 2 people. Both capable. Neither of them is you. He said it without flattery as a factual assessment. She sat with it. This was the part of the work that she'd never managed to fully resolve for herself, the question of where you were most useful versus where you'd put down something that felt, if not like roots, then at least like weight. The garden on Cutter Road. Harold Breck's breathing. The Thursday breakfasts. Mabry at his new job carrying something lighter than he'd carried before. What's the timeline on the decision? She said. End of month. He looked at her. It's not an order. You have the right to decline. I know, and if you decline, I know that too, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the diner window, Harwick Crossing was doing what it did on a September morning, moving slowly, with purpose. The way small places moved when the day had business in it, but no particular urgency. A woman she recognized was walking a dog on the far sidewalk. The hardware store across the street had a new sign she hadn't noticed before. For what it's worth, Fane said. What you built here, the record, the witnesses, the way it connected to Kessler, it's being used as a structural model for how to run long-form embedded investigations in county-level corruption cases. He paused. They're calling it the Vasek protocol in the internal documentation. She looked at him. They named it, someone did. I think it was Marsh originally, and it stuck. The corner of his mouth moved. You should know that. She thought about being 23, and in a field hospital in a place most people didn't know existed, learning that the difference between chaos and order was almost always one person deciding to act as though order was possible. She thought about 14 months in Harwick Crossing, and what it had required, and what it had cost, and what it had produced. She thought about the fact that she was 36 years old and had spent roughly a third of her life in service of a principle she'd never been entirely able to articulate, but had always been entirely clear about, that the people who abused power over others needed to be accountable to something, and that accountability didn't happen on its own, and that someone had to be in the room where it wasn't happening yet. She had never been able to stop being that person. She didn't think she was going to start. I'll have an answer by end of month, she said. Fane nodded. He knew what the answer was. She suspected she knew too, but she owed it to the people on Cutter Road and in this county to sit with the decision long enough that it was genuinely made rather than simply known. He left, and she sat at the corner table alone for a while, and the diner was its usual morning self around her, the family in the booth. By the window, the 2 highway workers at the counter, the waitress who'd been working here since before Lena arrived and would be working here after she left. She did go back to Cutter Road. She went back, and she worked the garden, which was producing more than she could use, and she brought tomatoes to Doris and to Harold Breck, and to the neighbor 2 doors, down whose name she'd finally learned. She ran her road in the mornings, and she worked her shifts, and she sat with the weight of the decision, the way she sat with anything that mattered. On a Thursday evening in the middle of the month, she was sitting on her back porch with a cup of tea she'd let go cold, looking at the garden in the late light, when her phone showed a message from Darlene Ocha. It was short. Commission held its first formal review today. Complaint from a county resident about a deputy's conduct during a traffic stop. We heard it, documented it, and opened a formal inquiry. First one. Thought you'd want to know. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down on the porch rail and looked at the garden. The tomatoes were doing better than she'd expected when she'd put them in. The cages she'd properly staked were holding. The beds she'd turned in the spring were producing in a way that made the neglected years visible. By contrast, she could see exactly where she'd started paying attention, and where she hadn't, and the plants made no distinction between the two. They just grew toward wherever there was enough of what they needed. She thought about what she'd said tomorrow, about holding the door open. The door was open now. What came through at the commission, the oversight structure, the two complainants sitting in seats with actual authority, Mabry at a job where he could do good work without carrying something that was breaking him, that wasn't her work anymore. That was the county's work. That was what happened when accountability structures were built to outlast the person who built them. She picked up her phone and sent Darlene Ocha back one line, "I'm glad. Keep going." She submitted her answer to Fane on the 28th of the month. Yes, one word. She was going. Not because Harwick Crossing was finished with her or she with it, but because there was another county, somewhere in another state, where the complaints were being buried and the witnesses were being managed, and the documentation was accumulating in someone's locked drawer, and the person carrying it was sitting with it alone and waiting for something to shift. She was not done being that shift. She gave her notice at Grover County Medical with 30 days, which was more than required and less than she would have liked to give. Fenn received it with a professional gravity that she respected more for the fact that he clearly didn't want to express it. Her coworkers received it in the varied ways that people received the news that someone they'd worked alongside was leaving, some of them practically, some of them with more feeling than she'd fully expected, one of them with the specific silence of someone who didn't trust themselves to say the right thing and had decided silence was safer. She said what she could to the people it mattered to. Doris got the full conversation, which lasted 2 hours at the kitchen table in Doris's house, with the barley soup and the lamp on against the gray October evening. Doris cried once, briefly, and then was annoyed with herself for it, and Lena told her there was no reason to be annoyed with herself and meant it. She told Doris that the Thursday table at the Dusty Fork was going to hold regardless of who was sitting at it, and Doris said that was not the point, and Lena said she knew it wasn't the point, and they sat with that for a while. She told Harold Breck she was going, and he took it the way a man in his mid-70s took most news, with the particular equanimity of someone who'd seen enough arrivals and departures that they no longer expected either to be permanent. He told her she was the best nurse he'd ever had, which was an extravagance from a man who didn't typically deal in extravagances, and she told him to call his daughter more often and make sure his concentrator was serviced in November. She told Mabry over coffee at the Kemper Diner. He was quiet for a moment when she said it, and then he nodded slowly. "Another county," he said. "Yes. Someone else who's carrying something they don't know what to do with. Something like that." He looked at his coffee. "I hope they're lucky enough to get you." She looked at him. "You did the work, Doyle. That was always you." "We did the work," he said, correcting her but not unkindly. "That's the part you're not great at seeing." She didn't argue with him, because he might have been right. She left Harwick Crossing on a November morning, with the truck packed to a reasonable level and the garden put to bed for the season and the safe emptied and returned to its factory settings. She dropped her key with the landlord the day before. She'd made her last Thursday breakfast with Doris that morning at the corner table, and they'd talked about everything except the fact that it was the last one, because some things were better honored by the continuation of ordinary ritual than by the ceremony of ending. She drove down Cutter Road one more time in the gray November light, past Harold Breck's house and the neighbor's fence in the field that ran along the south edge of the road, until the road curved and the field disappeared. 14 months. She thought about March 14th and the coffee cup and the sound of the diner door opening too hard. She thought about what it felt like to have handcuffs put on you in front of a room full of people who believed what they were seeing. She thought about the choice she'd made in that moment to be patient, not because she was naturally patient. She wasn't. But because patience was what the work required and the work was what mattered. She thought about Darlene Ocha saying coming back was the right choice, even though it was harder than not coming back. She thought about the questions she'd written on legal pads and the answers that had arrived sideways, while her hands were doing something else. She thought about a teenage boy named Micah on a highway barrier with a shaking hand and a question about whether a nurse and a soldier were different enough to be worth noting. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. She had spent her adult life in service of a principle she'd arrived at very early and never fully been able to abandon, that the people who were supposed to be protected deserved someone willing to pay attention to whether they actually were. That protection without accountability was just power in a different uniform. That the person in the room who knew the most didn't always have the loudest voice, and that sometimes the most consequential thing you could do was to be completely certain about your own purpose and completely quiet about your own pride. She wasn't a hero. She'd met heroes, and she knew what they looked like, and they mostly looked like Doyle Mabry, holding something hard for 14 months, because he couldn't figure out what else to do with it, and Darlene Ocha, filing a complaint twice in a county that had twice made her pay for it, and Preston Galt driving back from wherever he'd gone, because showing up again was the harder thing, and he'd decided the harder thing was the right one. What she was useful, trained and careful and useful, and willing to go where useful was needed, and that had always been sufficient reason. The highway entrance came up on the right, and she took it, and Harwick Crossing fell behind her the way things did when you drove away from them, first visible, then smaller, then gone. She had a long drive ahead of her. She had work to do. The woman they'd tried to make small had never needed them to see her clearly. She'd always known exactly who she was.